Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. Following his brush with church discipline, Dr. Thomas Murphy received an unusual invitation from a very surprising source, BYU. They wanted to talk about Native Americans and the Book of Mormon. So Tom will talk about his reaction and his surprising collaboration with researchers at BYU. Check out our conversation. All right, well, we need to jump back to the essay. That was what we were coming here for. So let's talk about the essay. And I don't know if you want to start off with what is good. 'Cause one of the things I like about this book is it feels like there's trying to be a balance. What's good about the essay? What's bad about the essay? What does the essay leave out? So I'm going to let you decide where you want to take us, but I would like to cover all three areas.
Well, could I start with a story about how this article happened? Because it's kind of an interesting story. Yeah. Okay. So I'd taken over a decade off from Mormon studies. As I mentioned, I've been doing all this work in Coast Salish communities, and I just didn't have time to do all that work in Mormon studies. So in 2014, I decided I was going to dip my feet back into Mormon studies, and I helped write an article for this book called Decolonizing Mormonism. Okay. That's edited by Gina Colvin and Joanna Brooks. And it's kind of the story of how I go from leaving Mormon studies after the DNA disciplinary stuff, and I was kind of, not feeling all that welcome in Mormon studies. And then I had these incredible opportunities working with Coast Salish nations, took me in a very different direction. And then how I came back to Mormon studies. So I had written that article in 2014. I think it didn't come out till 2018.
Yeah, these books take a long time to write, don't they?
And so, that book had come out. And because of this book, I got an invitation to participate in writing this book. Essays on American Indian and Mormon History. And this book just won a few days ago the John Whitmer Historical Association Best Anthology Award.
Oh, wow.
And so this is edited by P. Jane Hafen and Brendan Rensink. And P. Jane Hafen is from University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And Brendan Rensink at BYU. And so I get this. Well, actually, Angelo gets an email first from Brendan Rensink at BYU, and would you? Because both Angelo and I had articles in Decolonizing Mormonism, and so he says, "Would you be interested in coming to BYU and participating in a seminar on American Indian and Mormon history?"
Wow, that's interesting. From almost excommunicated to speaking at BYU, that's something.
Well, not speaking, it was more of a seminar, so kind of a small group, not a public setting.
Oh, okay.
But, Angelo says, "Do you know this Brendan Rensink?" And I said, well, I know Jane Hafen because she was mentioned it. And he's like, "I don't know about it. It's interesting that they're asking me because Angelo, he didn't, go through disciplinary action or anything, but he certainly, his position on the Book of Mormon was no different than mine." And so he was like, "Well, should I accept this or not?" And I encouraged him to. And then a few weeks later, I get an email asking me if I'd come to BYU and present an article on DNA in the Book of Mormon. And I'm like, I remembered what happened back in 2002. And I remembered that, I expected, I had been in correspondence with people like Scott Woodward, and Scott Woodward's related to my wife through marriage.
He's a professor at BYU, right?
Yeah, a microbiologist at BYU. And I expected a little more support than I got from my colleagues there. They really danced around the issues, and did not. I mean, I would say I'd give them some credit. They acknowledged that there were problems, but they focused much more on excuses for the problems than actually dealing forthrightly and honestly with the implications of the DNA evidence. And so
Hugo Perego too, right?
Yeah. Well, Hugo worked for Scott Woodward.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah. So I remembered that, and I'm thinking, do I want to go to BYU to do another article about DNA in the Book of Mormon? And so I had, in returning back to Mormon studies, I'd been trying to expand beyond just the DNA stuff, and I always have. And so, but it may not be known to all of your listeners.
You've been pigeonholed.
Publishing on Mayan and Nahua Mormons long before I did the DNA work, okay? And I was publishing on the Book of Mormon, doing critical theory analysis of the Book of Mormon before I did the DNA work. And so as I'm making this strategic move back into Mormon studies, do I want to be defined as the DNA guy? Not really. I don't want that to define me, because my work is much broader than that. And so I also thought, well, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with the idea of BYU editors editing my article on DNA in the Book of Mormon. So my response was, I'm not really interested in writing about DNA, but instead I proposed a different topic, an article called Other Scriptures, Restoring the Voices of the Gantawises to an Open Canon. And so this basically follows my Haudenosaunee ancestry, the Mohawk ancestry, and the Seneca as well, and looks at the Book of Mormon through the lens of Mohawk and Seneca oral tradition. And so I proposed that instead of a DNA article. And Brendan Rensink and Jane Hafen actually enthusiastically accepted that. So then they turned to Hugo Perego and asked him to do the DNA article. And as part of this seminar, they paid for me and all the other scholars, or most of the other scholars in the book, and even Hugo Perego, coming from Italy, brought him to BYU. And we had a seminar. We shared the kind of first drafts of our papers, then met in small groups and went over them. And I should emphasize that both of these two books have something distinctive and new to Mormon studies. And this is what was called a decolonizing methodology. And a decolonizing methodology, what it does is it centers indigenous perspectives in the analysis. So most of the stories of Mormon-Indian relations are much more about Mormons than the Indians, okay? And the sources are, almost all the Mormon settlers rather than the indigenous perspectives. It's a lot harder to get the indigenous perspectives in historical sources, okay? But they are there. You have to work a little harder. So a decolonizing perspective centers the indigenous perspectives in the analysis and in the data that you're looking at. And it brings that to the forefront of the academic work. And so both of these books have that emphasis. And, it's to BYU's credit that they are adopting that approach. Okay. And this is now coming from the Red Center for Western Studies at BYU. And so we share our articles and...
Can I ask what year this was? Was this 2017?
I think that's about right. Yeah.
Because I interviewed Hugo in 2017, and I think it was that same summer. So that's funny.
Yeah, because he would. Well, it was like June, I think.
Yeah.
Because it was right. Yeah, we did it in conjunction with the Mormon History Association meeting. So we also went to as a group to the MHA and.
Wow.
And so it was a great experience. It was very different than I'd had. In terms of that public struggle with BYU, I think things have started to change there. I think there's a commitment at BYU to engaging in instead of producing their own apologetic scholarship, engaging in Mormon studies in academic venues that are more widely recognized.
Well, this was also the time when farms essentially got kicked out of BYU and became the Neil Maxwell.
Yeah, right.
Neil Maxwell study.
Right. And so, I mean, I don't want to name names or anything, but I'll say that many of my colleagues at BYU were very gracious and encouraging of the work that I'm doing. And, it was a very heartwarming experience. Now, even with Hugo, so I didn't have my own transportation there. But Hugo had a car, and so he gave me a ride to the hotel, and we got a chance to just talk, carefully in person, and he shared some of his fears of disciplinary action, that like what happened to me, and that just I could relate to him at a personal level.
Well, now he wrote the essay, right? He told me that on the video.
Yeah, well, yeah. I learned, yeah, that's right. So he helped write the first draft of the LDS Church essay. But here's what happens at BYU. He did not adopt a decolonizing perspective. He did not center an indigenous voice. In fact, he didn't even cite an indigenous scholar in the first version of his paper. And Michael Ash had been a co-author on that first paper. And it was very similar to the line that you see in the LDS essay, the Gospel Topics essay. In the end, the editors decided not to include Hugo Prego's essay. And, kind of my regret on that is that it would have been nice to have a DNA essay in here. But
so this is for the seminar you're talking about.
Yeah. So so in the end, the people at BYU, at the Red Center anyway, we're not going to support that apologia, basically, that apologetic argument that ignored the indigenous perspectives. That wasn't acceptable to them. They rejected his article.
Wow.
Now, shortly after I had accepted this invitation to BYU, I get an email from Matt Harris and Newell Bringhurst. And now, Newell had been he'd been one of those mentors to me when I was a young scholar, and, really encouraging my work. And I remember he used to lament that I got all the attention that he had craved for, and for his scholarship.
Were you excited about all that attention? I don't think you were you?
Not necessarily. I mean, it was, sometimes it was kind of neat, but I would say overall, no. I
be careful what you ask for, right?
Right. Yeah. But anyway, Newell, had kind of this special place in my heart. So I get this invitation from him, and now he's asking me to write an article on DNA in the Book of Mormon. And I just said no to BYU. And I'm like, okay, I'll take this one on. But I gave them conditions. I said, I'll write an article for this, but I want an indigenous co-author. And I do have indigenous heritage, but I'm predominantly from the settler colonial side. I mean, that's where most of my ancestors.
You're both a pioneer and a laymanite, right?
Yeah, I'm not so sure about that term laymanite, but I have indigenous ancestry, but I didn't grow up in Haudenosaunee culture. I grew up in Mormon culture. I grew up in the land of Nephites and Lamanites, right in my head, right? Mm-hmm. That was my heritage. Was learned through the Book of Mormon, and I've spent a lot of my life now trying to unlearn that Mormon version of indigenous history and relearn the stories of my ancestors. And that's what I'd written about in here, was those surprising connections between Iroquois oral tradition and the Book of Mormon. So I won't want to go into another tangent, but there's a lot of interesting stuff there that shocked me.
We may have to have another
family genealogy. Yeah, as I was doing my own family genealogy, and I kept coming across these stories that, like, wait a minute, I heard that story before. It was a Mormon version, but it's a kind of warped version. And so this is like recovering those indigenous stories that make their way into the Book of Mormon, but are given this settler colonial emphasis, and say, okay, so well, how can we look at those indigenous, those original stories before they get kind of remade into something that's affirming to settler colonists, and rather than affirming to indigenous people. And so I did accept the invitation with the condition that Angelo joined me as a co-author. They accepted that invitation. And so Angelo and I wrote our first draft of the article. And what did we call that? The first draft was very different than what ended up in the book. We called it White Mound Builders and Plastic Lamanites. Mm. Basically our take was, why do Mormons care so much about American Indian bodies? Why does it matter what Native American DNA tells us about Native ancestry? Why do Mormons care? Why do Mormons need to dissect, dig up, excavate, investigate, extract, amplify that DNA and use, why does that matter for Mormon stories about who we are as Mormons? Why do we need indigenous bodies for that? And, Matt Harris and Newell Bringhurst, I think, were very patient with us, but that was not what they were looking for. And ironically, if we had submitted that same article, if I'd accepted the BYU invitation, I think we had submitted that same article to BYU, they would have accepted it. And I would have never predicted that. I had misconceptions.
So is BYU liberal now? Is that what you're trying to tell me?
Committed to engaging in the academic disciplines more broadly, I think is the way I would put it.
Because there is a movement that says BYU's gone too liberal, they're too secular, and they need to become more conservative.
I can see why people might say that, but it surprised me that I think that article would have been, as it was written, would have been accepted then.
Well, the conservatives are going to watch this video and they're going to say, look, even Thomas says that the BYU is too liberal.
I did not use those words. Those were your words. But I do think there's an opening to engagement at BYU that I think is actually more difficult for people like Matt Harris and Newell Bringhurst than it is for Brendan Rensink and Jane Hafen. And it is puzzling and interesting why, and I'm not sure I know all the answers. They need to speak for themselves on these issues. But I think, for one, I think Matt Harris and Newell Bringhurst were really looking for a kind of a formulaic model of an article. And that formula was more within what would be traditional Mormon studies, rather than this new wave of decolonizing methodologies. And I mean, in the end, they allowed us to still use a decolonizing methodology, but the structure of the article was more Western than indigenous, if that makes sense.
Okay.
It was more within the language of the colonized academia rather than the voice of the indigenous.
So you wanted to take it in a different direction than they did. That's interesting. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Thomas Murphy. In our next conversation with Tom, We'll talk about how the Gospel Topics essay on DNA in the Book of Mormon tackles Rodney Meldrum's Heartland theory.
The other thing that I really liked, and I'm sure this is partly Hugo's influence, is that they're quite critical of, they don't name them, but they're very critical of the Heartland hypothesis folks. They're very critical of Meldrum. What is it?
Rodney Meldrum, yeah. I want to get Rodney on. We'll have to get his rebuttal to this, but yeah, that's interesting. For those of you who are interested in the entire interview uncut without any interruptions, sign up at patreon.com/gospeltangents and you can hear the entire interview for just $5 a month. Also, we have other tiers. If you'd like to subscribe on our website at gospeltangents.com, click on the yellow subscribe button and you can subscribe for $10. You can also do that on Patreon and get a PDF transcript. We've also got some other ones for $15 and $20 if you'd like to get those as well. If you're interested in individual transcripts, go to Amazon.com and do a search for Gospel Tangents interview, and you can see our past interviews there in paperback form. So just check out Gospel Tangents. We're always updating those. For the latest updates on Facebook, go to facebook.com/gospeltangents, and you can see our latest updates there. We're also on Twitter at Gospel Tangents. Of course, you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts at tinyurl.com/gospeltangents. And please give us a 5-star rating for those of you who listen to the audio only. So once again, thanks for listening. Click here to subscribe, here for a transcript, and over here we've got some more of our great videos. Thanks again.